Whenever fans discuss Adventure Time's second miniseries, Islands, there's always a tendency to start with the show's protagonist. And while, of course, this video will get to Finn's reunion with his people and the devastating consequences of said reunion, I think it makes more sense to start with who the miniseries starts with: Susan.
Electricity!
Susan Strong, introduced all the way back in her Season 2 titular episode, is a character that took quite a while to find her footing in the show. Throughout her first 3 appearances, which stretch over 5 seasons, the character goes from mattering exclusively in orbit of Finn's humanity crisis to mattering pretty much exclusively in quotation marks. This is perhaps seen most clearly in how the show chooses to portray her species, with the first episode heavily implying that she's not human, the second episode ending with a statement that it doesn't matter whether or not she is human, and the third revealing that she's at least partially machine, but still mostly human. There are a few other things of note within this initial trilogy, with both Susan's Fish People family and the Superport Factory having some thematic ties to the eventual reveal of her origin, but in general, the character doesn't really come into her own until her 4th major appearance. Speaking of which, while Preboot and Reboot aren't actually part of Islands, with the show squeezing in the introduction of Fern in between, it certainly features the beginning of the story that this video will circle around. Starting with the first half, Preboot introduces several story beats from Islands, such as the character of Dr. Gross, as well as just the idea of there being an island of humans that Susan came from, but I think the most interesting element of the quarter hour is how they begin to develop some of the themes of the miniseries, notably the discussion of mechanically enhancing biological life. The show will pretty clearly demonstrate a mostly negative view of this, both through Dr. Gross's song about her mashup menagerie, a song that also serves as the second biggest indicator of Rebecca Sugar's absence in the show, as well as the reveal that the Doctor herself is mostly mechanical. The series will go on to discuss this idea significantly more, including outside of Islands when Finn himself becomes part machine 2 episodes later, but the concept of muddying what it means to be human really starts here. This entire episode feels perfectly uneasy, with Dr. Gross's only non-flashback appearance heavily adding to this. Ultimately though, rather than stick around to discover more about her past, Susan sends the only indication of such as far away as possible, ending Preboot exactly the way it started. Well, besides the giant electric eel. Reboot also continues to set up little pieces of plot for the miniseries to follow, most importantly through Susan requesting transportation, but again, it's the characterization of biological technology that feels the most prevalent for what story the show wants to tell. During the fight with the aforementioned electric eel, Susan gets shocked, which ultimately triggers her implant and causes her to go bonkers. This is a moment that initially feels similar to something like Aang hitting a rock in a weird way and it fixing all of his problems, something that I would usually complain about, but I think it's a critical moment here. If Susan's implant had instead gotten purposely triggered by Dr. Gross, then it would have felt like the character had been infiltrated by this evil that has now caused her to act in this way. But that isn't what happened. Instead, this drive for violence, these abilities designed for overpowering anybody in her way by any means necessary, this stuff was within Susan this entire time. From the moment we first saw the character on screen, she has always been a single shock away from losing all autonomy, severing any connection she had built with those who knew. It's terrifying. Eventually though, Susan does regain control after her implant is destroyed, but it doesn't really do anything to mitigate this underlying atmosphere of machine interference. An atmosphere that isn't going away anytime soon. And besides just being set up for the next 7, that's a lot of what the first proper episode of Islands is about as well. This idea of an idyllic ooh being ravaged by this unfeeling metal force they don't understand, coming to uproot Finn and Susan no matter what. Throughout the first episode, titled The Invitation, both Finn and to an extent Susan will try to downplay why going on this trip to the latter's home island is so important to them, and therefore we only really get PB's take on it. It's a quick moment and it's right at the very end, but Bonnie essentially tells Finn, in no uncertain terms, this trip is going to hurt. Either he'll come back empty-handed, more confident than ever that he truly exists in a world void of his species, or he'll discover that, for his entire life, humanity has always been a single boat ride away. As Bubblegum puts it, it's some pretty heavy stuff for our protagonist. Speaking of which,
You got this, Finn Mertens. You're a buff little bionic baby. Rush!
Finn's lack of human relations is something that's pretty hard to ignore in any reading of the show. It's just something that's always been core to some of the most memorable moments for his character. From early on, like the end of the aforementioned titular Susan episode, where he mourns what he believes to be the loss of his first glimpse at humanity, to just the previous season, where he wistfully watched his farm world equivalent enjoy the type of family he never got to experience. Of course, Finn has technically interacted with fellow members of his species before, but never in exactly ideal circumstances. As he mentions in Preboot, the entire list of humans that he's met include Ice King, who's immortal and crazy, Betty, who's a time traveler and crazy, Martin, who sucks and is vaguely not human anymore, and Susan, who he doesn't actually believe to be fully human. Oh, and Mo, I guess, but the show kind of considers his cyborgness to be different than Dr. Gross's or Susan's for some reason. Anyway, besides that, and the aforementioned farm world version of himself, that's been it as far as human-to-human contact, and it's been pretty clearly weighing on the character, something that's explored further in the miniseries' second episode. Whipple the Happy Dragon is an episode that, while entertaining, doesn't exactly contain a ton of stuff that's super interesting to analyze. However, tucked neatly into this quarter hour, we do get what's pretty easily the most clear-cut explanation for why Finn wants to go on this journey. It is ultimately like 20 seconds, but essentially, Finn describes how, whereas his friends all have the history of their people before their birth to help define them, Finn literally has nothing he himself could not remember, and it's that feeling that keeps eating at him. And besides just eliminating the idea that Finn could possibly just be trying to find a place to settle down with people who look like him, I really love how this angle frames the next 6 episodes. No matter what Finn discovers about the fate of the humans, whether he finds a thriving society or an island filled with corpses, a part of him that was always missing could suddenly be filled. So while this episode will end with our trio plus BMO getting separated and therefore setting up the rest of the miniseries, I still think this is its biggest impact, demonstrating the stakes this has for our protagonist. However, we do still have some shenanigans to sift through before that fully comes to fruition. I think, initially, it's pretty easy to gloss over the next 2 episodes. If the point of Islands is to explain Susan and Finn's past, then these 2 episodes pretty much do none of that. However, besides just being immensely entertaining, I think a good bit of what Islands is going for doesn't really work nearly as well without this pair, as we continue to get several more instances of humanity mucking things up with technology. Starting with Mysterious Island, this episode has a lot of ground to cover visually, given that Finn's the only English speaker for the first 90 or so percent, and I think it rises to that challenge excellently. Even before we meet Alva, the first human without a caveat that Finn has met since he was an infant, this episode is already atmospheric as hell. I just love the ability of this one to introduce a place that arguably seems more like our Earth than anything else in the show, and then immediately turn it on its head with rapidly shifting weather and giant creatures. There's this possible initial expectation that what Finn may discover about humanity may be significantly less wacky than what he has back in OO, but it's made pretty clear here that that just isn't going to be the case. Getting to Alva though, while it doesn't make much canonical sense that she speaks Swedish when everybody on the other islands speaks exclusively the same language as Finn, it does help this episode achieve this feeling of dissatisfaction within our protagonist. After crossing an ocean and getting separated from his possibly deceased friends, Finn has finally met a non-crazy, non-bionic, modern-day human, and he can't even communicate with her. It's a gut punch that the show somewhat skips past in order to get to the next one, but it still does create this really interesting moment. Speaking of that subsequent gut punch, after the hubris of humanity once again sends a storm, Finn and Alva get the first quiet moment of the miniseries, with a tape displaying the downfall of what Finn believes may be the bulk of humanity. And besides just the aesthetics being stellar here, I think the real tour de force during this scene is just how much humanization they fit during the beginning here. Throughout the next 5 episodes of this miniseries, we'll see a bunch of other modern-day Homo sapiens, and yet I'd argue that none of them seem as human as Alva's fellow researchers. There's just this feeling that this is the human colony that Finn desperately wanted to find at the end of this voyage, and now he's left just watching proof that he was too late. Human interest in supplementing nature with mechanical interference has taken that away from Finn, and as he's about to find out, it's not alone in that. Episode 4, Imaginary Resources, is a bit more straightforward. And while there are, of course, dozens of examples of media tackling a very similar theme, that being the idea of humanity giving everything up for a hypothetically perfect digital life, I do think there's a good bit about this one that separates it from the rest. First, and this is something that applies to every episode we're talking about today, but this is Adventure Time at its comedic peak. Every piece of dialogue is perfectly off kilter, the visual gags like Jake and the Egg are wonderfully executed, and I'm just entirely certain that there's never been a VR world as inherently comedic to look at as better reality. And despite all of that though, I think my favorite bit might just be the subversion after Jake turns off the world, when you expect the zombie-looking denizens of the island to pose a zombie-esque threat, and they just don't. Again, as you'd expect, this one also presents an example of technology sucking the humanity out of people, but I think the more interesting aspect of the episode is something that it doesn't do. At the climax of this quarter hour, when Jake has freed everybody from their virtual reality prison, there's a beat where you expect Finn to try and convince them all that a perfect life devoid of danger isn't worth living, and he just doesn't. They do get Bimo out of there, but everybody else is left to just rot in a pod as the island dwindles out. This episode is inherently a bit too lighthearted to fully dive into the implications of such a decision, but I do think it sets up Finn's goal in the final episode of this miniseries pretty well. Anyway, while these two episodes are a bit more interesting than I think most tend to give them credit for, you know what two episodes are next, and I couldn't be more excited to finally talk about them.
Kara.
Yes, Dr. Gross?
About every year or so, I'll make a list of my favorite episodes of Adventure Time. With nearly 300 options to choose from, it's just a very fun show to do that type of thing with, especially when comparing how I felt about certain episodes at certain times. And throughout doing this, there's no installment that's risen as consistently as Island's 5th episode. There's just something about these 11 minutes, something about the dynamic between Susan and Frida in a world that's impossible to understand that I just love so deeply. I'm getting ahead of myself. On the surface, Hide and Seek is an episode that's primary responsibility is explaining the core human society that Finn and Susan emerged from. Sure, the previous two episodes do show what some humans are currently up to, but it's clear that the hub and Founders Islands are what mattered most, and it's this episode that really does a good bit of explaining what they look like the last time Finn and Susan were there. A good bit of this is covered in the Founders song, which is also the #1 indicator of Rebecca Sugar's absence from the show, but also there's just a ton of little details in the background here that paint the picture of this technologically advanced prison, one that turns out seekers to hunt down those who dare wish for another way of life, and experimenters to make those seekers stronger. I think that Dr. Gross's earliest chronological appearance here does a lot to add to this effect, as the fact that she is able to remain undefeated throughout this episode more so allows her to remain this unstoppable representation of the problems of the island. All in all, it's just this brutal depiction of a society hellbent on fixing what they perceive to be the issues of their predecessors, but only creating a colony of hunters and the hunted in the process. But none of that is why this is one of my favorite episodes of the show, as that honor falls almost entirely on the shoulders of Frida and Susan, or Kara as this episode reveals she was once called. While we have gotten just a glimpse at Frida before, this episode has the entire responsibility of introducing the character, her dynamic with Susan, and where said dynamic ultimately falls apart. And it's so damn impressive how well they pulled this off. From the jump, this episode utilizes comparisons between the two to somewhat characterize them as quickly as possible. As Susan's a seeker while Frida's an experimenter, Susan wears a dog hat while Frida wears a cat hat, and Susan becomes physically and emotionally morphed by education over time, while Frida just stays the same. The scene of them both as kids is just such a wonderful early gut punch, as the seeds of misguided loyalty within Frida's closest friend is so clearly already eating away at her. When we do get back to the pair after a quick glimpse at Finn's parents, they've seemingly grown up in the blink of an eye, now gazing at the stars together and talking about the world they've never seen and the people they've never met. It's just this altogether stunning scene, and yet one that Susan can't even get through without almost threatening Frida. There's simply this juxtaposition between the absolutely beautiful art direction and music of the scene and the kind of horrifying implications of it, as the opposing ideologies of these two friends is slowly ripping them apart and one of them can't even see it. The ending here too is a moment I find myself continuing to be drawn to, as after Frida shows Susan the text she's made, choosing to make art instead of the violent experiment she's supposed to be working on, Susan attributes its quality to their society that would certainly stomp out such a creation and its creator without second thought. When we next see the pair, Frida has made a run for it. She is stopped by Susan, and it's not like she was going to get very far without an engine anyway, but just the idea that she's decided that a chance at freedom is worth throwing away both relative safety and every relationship she's ever had completely weighs over the rest of the episode. It also obviously hits Susan like a truck. The idea that the person she cares most about hates the civilization she's devoted her life to so much that she'd throw away everything. The ideas that Frida mentions in the cave about being willing to put up with a little risk and a little pain if it means getting to actually be herself just completely contradict the lessons that Susan has literally had beamed into her brain. And therefore, she has to believe that Frida's lying. That there must be some other reason that she's trying to escape, that there just has to be. If you've seen this episode, then you know what the most heartbreaking moment of it is, and I'm not going to try to contest it. But I do think that the loud final moments of the episode somewhat overshadow the quiet devastation of this scene's ending, when Frida realizes that Susan is going to report her. Of course, Frida isn't 100% sure, and when it's revealed, she still is shocked. But it's this expression right here, when Susan refuses to promise otherwise, that just gives it away. Frida can't trust her only friend, and it's just gut-wrenching. When Susan returns to the cave after a not-so-reassuring pep talk from Dr. Gross, the sun is just barely over the horizon. It won't be for long. At first, it seems like Susan has made peace with Frida's decision, even assisting her on the way out and giving her the literal final push she needed. It's never outright confirmed, but I am under the impression that this is indeed genuine by the character. That even if she can't understand it, she's come to the decision to let her friend make her own choices. But the time to make that decision has far passed. The scene as Susan is overpowered by her implant and forced to betray Frida is one of my favorites from the entire series for several reasons, from the already gorgeous background suddenly shifting to a darker shade, to some of the best vocal performances in the show. But there's one moment here that I always come back to: the reveal of Frida's hair. The slow motion and slicing sound effects make it pretty obvious that this is something the show wants you to focus on, and yet I think there are a few different interpretations that make sense here. Somewhat inherently, any interpretation of this scene has to include just how violently this act is portrayed, as part of Frida is exposed against her will, but I think the fullest look at this scene has to take into account why most humans in the show wear animal hats in the first place. As indicated by the previous miniseries, the Homo sapiens of Oo wear the show's famous head attire for protection against predators such as vampires, with the tradition of it transforming into being mostly symbolic in the safe haven of the islands. For what remains of humanity, these hats represent safety from those who wish to hurt them, the mitigation of any conceivable danger, and it's only when this is removed that we finally see what makes Frida, Frida. What allows her to stand out from those around her. Unfortunately though, once that part of her is revealed, the part she's desperately tried to hide until she could finally let it out, it's only a matter of time until it gets stuffed right back into the hat. There are approximately a bajillion impressive things that Adventure Time has done, but the fact that they turned Susan, a somewhat joke character almost certainly intended to never return, into the focal point of this immensely compelling quarter hour of television has to be up there. A truly staggering 11 minutes of animation that both sets up the themes and the world of the following 3 episodes, while also presenting the type of devastating vignette that said world inevitably creates. And yet, somehow, after this point, the devastation doesn't really slow down. As As you probably could have guessed, Hide and Seek is my favorite Islands episode, but it's still pretty easy to see how Min and Marty became the Islands episode. After a quick bit of a frame story where the show clues in any viewers who haven't figured out the whole Finn's parents thing, we launch pretty hard into the backstory behind these characters, starting with a quick reminder of Martin's baseline assholeness. A good bit of this episode will characterize Finn's father in such a way that makes it somewhat easy to forget about the man the rest of the series reveals him to be, so I think it's pretty critical that this early scene confirms that this has always somewhat been who Martin Mertens is. There's this sentiment among some factions of the Adventure Time fandom who wish to categorize Martin as a good man who turned bad after hitting his head or whatever, but I've always thought that this episode more clearly represents a guy who tried to do good for once in his life and was swiftly punished for it. Moving past that tangent though, before every comment becomes about it, one major difference between this episode and the last is the decision to focus on a few key events rather than getting snippets of the entire relationship. While this episode does obviously indicate that these two were together for at least a year, we only actually get to see 2 interactions between them with dialogue, and a montage of their life in between. Starting at the hospital, the bulk of the pair's first meeting consists of Martin desperately trying to convince Minerva that he isn't trying to con her, and the doctor desperately falling for both it and him anyway. It's, of course, a scene in retrospect that's a little bit haunting, as Minerva is talked into making a decision that will ultimately wreck her life, but it's also just undeniably charming. Perhaps it's because Martin is a pretty funny guy when he's not your father, but there's just this essence that this episode captures that allows you to feel for this couple immediately. Undeniably though, the biggest contributor to this overwhelming sense of dread for what is to come is the absolutely stunning song at the center of this one, Greatly Appreciated. I'm sure you don't need me to explain why this piece of music works so well, a wonderful yet wistful description of a relationship precariously built, but it's just so damn effective at removing any doubt that this all might be part of Martin's giant con. The guy we see taking care of his kid in his home without any complaint at the end of the episode bears nothing but visual resemblance to the guy we saw playing both sides of this horrific conflict 8 minutes prior. Now that he's settled into this less chaotic life, it seems like Martin truly is done with the shady activities of his past. If only they were done with him as well. There is a ton to greatly appreciate about the scene that comes next. It's funny, well animated, and it has some of the smoothest action the show has to offer, but there's nothing I love about it more than just how chaotic it feels. After a slow and methodical presentation of these two people from opposite sides of society coming together to create something beautiful, the scene that ripped it apart really needed to feel like it was ripping it apart. And man, does Martin's final good deed fill that need. But besides just literally ripping Martin and Minerva apart, this episode also somewhat destroys a good bit of our notion of who Finn's father was. Sure, during this scene, Martin makes a dozen or so mistakes that will ultimately cost him and everybody he loves everything, but I think it's impossible to argue that he wasn't doing what he thought was best. Both before and after this point, it's pretty easy to get the feeling that Martin is lying in almost all of his interactions. But when he tells baby Finn that he's going to come back, it's really hard to not believe him. All throughout this miniseries, we've seen the somewhat well-intentioned technology of the humans backfire in ways they could have never imagined, but it's never felt quite as ironic as this. This machine that was once built to keep all of humanity together has now inadvertently ripped a family apart, with nobody left to tell the tale. After all the devastation of the last few minutes, this one feels like it should end in the same way that Hide and Seek did, with an explosion of emotions from Minerva. But that's not what happens. Instead, the stunned and despondent doctor just gets up, shakes it off, and puts back on her hat. The final time we see Finn's mother in the flesh, she's making an expression that's not uncommon within the show, as it's the face one makes when thinking about what has been lost. Before Min and Marty, there were 249 quarter hours of Adventure Time that chose to not reveal where Finn came from, setting up an almost impossible standard for any one episode that would dare choose to tackle that story. And yet, despite all of that pressure, I'm not sure I've ever heard a single person claim that Islands wasn't up to the task. In back-to-back episodes, the show has now set up and destroyed two deeply enthralling relationships, producing a pair of some of the series' most heartbreaking moments. And now it's time for quite a bit of reconciliation.
Haha, that's right! You got fooled by Frida!
While all of Islands is obviously one connected story, no 2/4 hours feel as conjoined as Episode 7, Helpers, and Episode 8, The Light Cloud, with neither really telling a complete story on their own. Therefore, for the sake of the video, I'm going to talk about them as if they were one combined installment. Anyway, semantics out of the way, the remainder of this miniseries ultimately spends the bulk of its time trying to somewhat resolve the revelations of the previous two flashbacks, starting with Susan and Frida. Something I really love about the way they choose to address the inherent tension in hide and seek is how they choose to initially lean into how a show would stereotypically handle something like this. Susan sees Frida in a crowd, follows her to work, waxes poetic about the difficulties of coming back into somebody's life after you've hurt them, walks in, Frida's shocked, and then nothing. Just like everything else, Frida's over it. Of course, from the jump, there are signs that she hasn't entirely thrown away her desire for freedom. From her initial reaction to the fact that she works at a toy shop, the one form of fun they seemingly allow on Founders Island, but it's still a pretty unexpected gut punch that the fiery teenager we last saw bawling at her friend's betrayal has now been re-educated into what we currently see on screen. A character that's visually almost hilariously identical to her past self, but closer in demeanor to those she once rebelled against. After Frida's only escape attempt resulted in so much pain and what she perceived to be the loss of her only friend, it does make sense that she now actually believes that bad things happen to those who wish to leave. This, of course, destroys Susan, who has now lived the life she ripped away from Frida. And while the rest of this plotline does get somewhat interrupted by what Finn has going on, as Frida ultimately becomes her old self after silently watching Finn talk to other people, I do think that this kind of works in showcasing that this desire for more was right under the surface for Frida. For the rest of the episode, as Finn goes through some of the most traumatizing stuff imaginable, and besides a quick piece of dialogue where Susan decides to stay as Susan instead of Kara to more closely reflect the person she's turned out to be, Frida and Susan mostly just have cute little interactions as they prepare to go on more adventures together, something that Fiona and Kate confirms they're still doing 12 years later. I've mentioned this before, and it unfortunately seems deeply unlikely nowadays, but my number one pick for an Adventure Time spinoff has always been something focused on these two characters, as I think Islands just unfortunately couldn't devote a ton of time to the post-hide-and-seek version of them. Even just a Distant Land style special where they took down Dr. Gross or something would be seriously sick, but I'm getting off topic here. To wrap up their storyline in Islands, it's simply one of the most well-crafted that Adventure Time ever had to share. It perfectly gives Susan something to do that's actually interesting, it allows for more thematic and expository setup for what Islands is ultimately more focused on, it's just a part of the show I always find new things in whenever I come back to it. And while I do think the ending of it is perhaps a bit short on time, when you remember what it made time for, I might just be okay with that too.
I love you, but your mom's 100 robo-clones.
I've talked about this in videos before, but I've always found Finn's first interaction with Martin to be a stroke of absolute genius from the show. After setting up how meaningful this will be for the character and having him go through some of the most impactful sacrifices of the show in order to finally meet this man, the reveal that he's just this immensely shitty dad allowed the show to do things with Finn that it never really could before. Putting him through this cosmic disappointment that really couldn't be resolved just sets up this wonderful arc for Finn that ultimately ends up being some of my favorite stuff they do with the character. All of that being said, the fact that they also found an entirely different yet equally interesting way for his first maternal interaction to be gut-wrenching is genuinely astounding. After a few goofy Adventure Time interactions where Finn figures out what's going on, we eventually get a full explanation for why there are countless robots that look just like his mother all across Founders Island, as Minerva tells him through a computer screen that she uploaded her brain as a result of a devastating pandemic. Just as you'd expect, Finn doesn't exactly love this information, but the miniseries will actually save most discussion of that for the very end, so I will follow suit there. First though, the majority of the interactions between Robo-Mother and son is spent with her trying to convince him that he has to stay on Founders Island where it's safe, rather than go back to the death trap that is most of Ooo. If this sounds familiar, it's a tangentially similar proposition to that of the comet back at the end of season 6. The idea that everyday life's risk of pain might not be worth it, but I think that Islands does play it a bit differently. While Finn's speech to the people that ultimately only convinces Frida might pretty much solely be about the value of new experiences and risk and such, that doesn't do much to convince Minerva. Instead, the turning point of the episode, what changes his mother from wanting to kill and upload all of humanity to instead offering her son a cruise ship out of there, is Finn allowing her to see the full extent of the person he turned out to be. Unlike Martin, whose entire purpose was to pretty much be the exact opposite of his son, Finn ultimately, despite growing up in this supposedly terrible land, turned out very similarly to his mother. The limited things that we see Minerva in the flesh do, from helping those who can't help themselves to being swindled by those who don't deserve help, all resemble things that we've seen Finn do as well. As she'll put it, and just like his mother, Finn turned out to be a helper. It's this culmination of Finn's character that only a show that's gone on for hundreds of episodes can really pull off. A full categorization of its complex protagonist under a single term, and it ties this specific arc to the rest of the series really damn well. But as I mentioned before, this final half hour somewhat put the trauma of its big reveal on the back burner in order to explore this whole helper angle, so it only makes sense that the episode ends with said trauma. And while throughout this video I have used terms like gut-wrenching or heartbreaking or devastating quite a bit, I think the final 60 or so seconds of Islands just absolutely takes that crown. As Finn sails away from Founders Island and from the rest of humanity for what he believes could be the final time, he puts on a better reality headset, and for a brief moment experiences exactly that. In a recreation of the family home he doesn't remember, Finn experiences the closest he'll ever get to a true physical connection with a biological family member ever again. As the pair embrace, Finn asks this digital representation of his mother whether or not she's truly the same person she used to be, whether or not she's still the same person she was the last time they met. And as the miniseries comes to a close, Minerva tells her son this.
I don't know for sure, but I feel like it's me. I hope that's enough.
While Finn graciously doesn't answer his mother here, I think the subsequent silent weeping can't help but do so. Even if you do believe that Upload has allowed Minerva to remain her true self past death, I think it's pretty clear that you can't say the same for the relationship she has with the people around her. This entire miniseries has been about Finn searching for humanity, and it's pretty damn hard to describe Minerva's set of robotic clones as being representative of that. And in a miniseries filled with devastation, from families being ripped apart to the most painful of betrayals, I'm not sure that anything hurts quite as much as this. Despite Islands ending in this way, with its protagonist weeping into the final credits, I don't think the ultimate purpose of the miniseries was to be as sad as possible. As Finn and Susan set sail across the ocean, the goal of their trip was to answer questions about their origins, about themselves. Something that PB warns will almost certainly come with some pain, and it's pretty hard to argue that they didn't succeed on that front. The Finn that we see after this miniseries is a character that is significantly more comfortable about why and how he is who he is, and I'm not sure that was ever possible without the revelations of this episode. So while Islands was a miniseries that touched on a bunch of stuff, from the intersection of technology and biology to the pitfalls of a life that only prioritizes a lack of risk, I think the ultimate focus ended up being what it means to be human. And for Finn and Susan, it meant having a connection with the past and the present of your species, however uncomfortable said connection may be. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to everybody who made it through my longest video on this show yet. This is one that I've meant to and promised to cover for literal years, so finally getting out to you guys is obviously really personally exciting. If you want to see even more of my animation takes for some reason, you can find me on the Twitter alternative where the skies are blue. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in a month or so with another one of these goofy little analyses. Thanks for watching.